So can we start by like introducing yourself? Like, how did you get into music? Have you always wanted to play some music? And yeah.
So I grew up in the city Shanghai, China, for a huge part of my childhood. Um, and Shanghai is a really interesting city because it has such a diverse range of architecture styles, like
Hmm.
skyscrapers, traditional Chinese architecture, and also European style villas from a historical time period when Europeans kind of took over control of parts of the city. So I think growing up in such a visually stimulating environment, I at first actually aspired to be an architect. I thought I was very inspired by my surroundings. I loved doing visual arts, so I drew a lot of buildings, bridges, and so on and so forth like that. Um, but I also played violin, and I remember very clearly the first time I ever played in youth orchestra, I was in the second violin section. And being in second violin section, I was able to hear kind of what's going on around me. Both the melodic line happening above, the bass line below me, how I'm playing my part to fill out the harmonies, and so on and so forth. So I felt like that aspect of teamwork in music really appealed to me and made me realize for the first time how much fun it actually can be to do music. And I think I eventually discovered composition because writing music for me feels like this kind of perfect combination of being able to do music, being able to work with other people to make music, but also creating from scratch or creating on a blank canvas the way that you would do in visual arts. So I
Hmm.
think that's what drew me to compose music. And I think I'm very fortunate that basically since high school I haven't stopped writing music, that I found it to be my calling and I haven't stopped since. So if I had to do the math, that's probably around 17, 18 years of writing music at this point.
Wow. And you mentioned that you were from China. And I imagine that you had some hard times growing up in the US. And do you think you took any inspiration from your childhood or like what is like your initial process of composing?
Yes, so in fact, for most of my childhood, I lived in China again, but I attended like international schools and specifically
Mm.
Shanghai American School for a long time. Okay, and that's an interesting dichotomy because in school I was taking a lot of classes that a typical U.S. high school student would take, right? Like AP US history for like I did all my APs and everything, took my SAT and everything. But then once you leave the school campus, you're in Shanghai. Like it's like growing up in China. So I felt like I was very fortunate to have that best of both worlds. And I think again that is reflected in my music. I think in two ways. Number one is list some of my music that for sure deals with or is inspired by certain Chinese traditions, right? Chinese East
Hmm.
Asian traditional music, for example. But I think actually more interestingly, growing up in a time when China's building a lot of infrastructure, when there's like huge airports being built, um, huge skyscrapers being built, I think that's probably one reason actually a lot of my music is inspired by architecture and transportation because that's the China I knew and grew up in. And I think I'm still reflecting on that kind of fascination with all of that, in my subsequent work as the composer. But at the same time, I think I now seek a lot of inspiration in natural landscapes and being out in
Mm.
nature. Like I love, visiting all the like national parks and stuff like that. I love hiking and so on and so forth. And I think that's also because growing up I didn't get to do that. So I think now getting to explore that I think has been really interesting and I'm very grateful for that addition to, what I love to do, but also what I seek inspiration in.
Mm, okay. And are there any new like unexplored areas of your composition or like new directions that you would like to go like explore?
Yes. And in fact, my understanding of writing is that every new piece I write is trying to find, or the process of writing every new piece is trying to find this middle point between parts of my language or parts of my writing that is solidly in my comfort zone, and then also using a new piece's opportunity to expand that said comfort zone, to try something that I haven't tried before. And that's very broadly defined. I think it could be something as specific as a sonority I really haven't tried before, or a certain, collection of pitches that I want to explore further. But I think more broadly, I would love to write more uh, works that involve collaboration, whether that's interdisciplinary, for example, writing more for dance, writing more vocal music so that I get to work with more poets or work more with text. I
Mm,
think ultimately I would love to be able to expand and do more work that is teamwork, really, that really is getting to make something bigger than what I can produce. And I think I feel most inspired when I have more collaborators I'm bouncing off ideas, whether that is, for example, a soloist that I'm working with to write a concerto, or it could be someone writing the words for perhaps an opera, or again, a choreographer with an idea for a dance piece, perhaps. I think that's where I am at my creative best, when I am challenged and I'm also in dialogue to make something bigger than what I can dream up with alone.
mm. And regarding your teamwork, I just wanted to say that like when I was practicing my part on the cello for the Continental Express, I like when I played it with like the orchestra, it was like a completely different song than I imagined. So I think it's really cool how you like manage to make different sounds with teamwork. And is there like a specific piece that you would like to share? Rather that be like the key musical ideas or like the process behind it?
Yes, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about Continental Express now that you bring it up, because I think that piece I think it encapsulates quite a few of my current interests and my sort of ideas of who I am as a composer. So again, going to this, so first of all, Continental Express is a work for orchestra that imagines a high-speed rail journey across America, right? So
Hmm.
this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about being fascinated by infrastructure and transportation, whether that's airports, airplanes, or in this case, trains, and the idea of taking a long journey on trains. But I structured this piece as um, five individual sections, as you know, that explore different landscapes across America. So I think this is also going into my own experience more recently, right? Being able to take road trips and seeing more parts of America, particularly the vast kind of expansive as in like large landscape idea um, of these vistas you get out in the West, right?
Hmm.
So I ended up structuring this piece as kind of starting from a city and ending in a city, but in the middle we get to go through three different environments: the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the Mojave Desert. So
Hmm.
that's kind of how I framed the overall storyline of the work, and then or kind of like a structural sort of vessel that I can then pour in the musical material. And so because you play cello, right? You know that you played a sort of like a mechanical motive, if you will, which to me represents the train itself, right?
Hmm.
That carries throughout in different parts of the piece. And above that motif, then I can build different material on depending on what section we're in. So that's kind of how I thought about how I conceived of the piece. Um, I think any piece I write, I try to think about the context that it's going to be performed, right? And so this piece is a co-commission really because it's the New York Youth Symphony, but it's also Interlochen Center for the Arts in
Mm,
Michigan. So I was thinking already about the fact that it's going to be played in two, you know, geographically different places in America. And then subsequently, we also confirmed a performance with the Colorado College Summer Music Festival,
oh, really?
which is in Colorado Springs, right? Which is just by the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. So thinking about all these elements, I think helped me actually come up with the piece's concept, right? Because knowing that the piece itself will travel, I thought it would be very fitting to write a piece about traveling, right?
Mm,
Um, and I think the last part of that puzzle is that again, when you ask, how did I first kind of fall in love with music? I thought back to how important it was for me to have experiences in youth orchestras. Um, and how that, again, helped me first discover like this vast world of orchestral music and how much, amazing music and how amazing experiences I get to have as a player in an orchestra, right? But interestingly, Interlochen's also a special place in my heart because that's actually the first place I ever visited in the US. It was because as a high school student, I participated in their summer camp,
mm,
studying composition. It's also, I think, the first place I ever had composition lessons. So to be able to return 15 years later as a guest composer and have my music played also, I think coincidentally the day after July 4th, and have a piece about inspired by American landscapes. I feel like it is so serendipitous. It's so many elements and threads of things that I've been thinking about coming together. And so I again going back to the idea of youth orchestra, knowing that I'm going to be writing for youth orchestra and slightly younger players, I was also thinking about how much I love attending youth orchestra concerts because there's always so much energy and enthusiasm that comes on and dedication from the players that I've experienced,
mhm,
even as a audience member. So I kind of wanted to capture a little bit of that and to encourage that in the music, which again is why the music starts off energetically and of course ends energetically with a big ending, right?
mhm. And you mentioned that you started writing in high school, right?
Hmm.
And so obviously you have a lot of experience, and I'm sure you saw like the classical and music industry change a lot. And so in your opinion, what would be like the biggest challenges faced by like contemporary composers and performers in like the music industry like today?
Wow, that's a important question. Wow, let me think a little bit. So I think, mm, so on one hand, I think being a contemporary classical slash concert music composer, we have this unique challenge of um, essentially being programmed with Beethoven, Mozart, and Dvorak and so on and so forth. So I think sometimes it can be challenging really explaining even what we do as composers that live today, right? But I kind of like to think about this not so much as a challenge, but an opportunity, because I think when we are living composers, we really are taking in, what's going around, what's happening all around us, whether that's environmental, whether that's cultural, whether that could be perhaps political, right? It's whatever you categorize as happening around us. I think even sometimes subconsciously we're channeling all that when we then write music. So in some ways, there's nothing more important than having contemporary living voices telling these stories. Um, just as we understand when we listen to Beethoven, we're not just hearing Beethoven, we're also understanding his worldview, the world he was living in when he composed. I think there's something very valuable and precious about writing music today so that later on people understand the world we are in, right? Which
Hmm.
might feel sometimes like there's a million things happening or it's very chaotic or whatnot. So I think this kind of having a cultural avenue to reflect on what's happening, I think is quite important. And I think is part of what makes what we do, in my view, meaningful. And again, this can be something that's subconscious. It doesn't have to be overt, although it can be. But I think just the fact that we are writing 2026 will tell other people in the future something about 2026
Mm.
that's different than any sort of other medium.
And I think 2026 is like a really special year, especially because like all the new technologies that's coming out, such as like AI composition tools. And what is your vision for like the future of like music composition like with these technologies? Mm.
In my more optimistic view, I would say that I really hope and want to explore how AI can streamline some of the very onerous parts of the composition process. For example, making parts. Currently, my notation software, so I use Sibelius, it's not so smart when it comes to parts. So I have
Mm.
to spend a lot of time formatting, right? So I'm just hoping that there's going to be software or AI assisted technology that makes that part streamlined so that we can get more time back to do the creative thinking rather than the logistical thinking. Um, but I think there's some talk about like if AI can just generate music in 10 seconds, like what's the point or what's the role of being a composer, right?
Mm.
I think ultimately because AI exists, and again, this might be an optimistic take, but I think that maybe we will actually appreciate more what's solely human, what can never be replaced by AI, what can never be generated by AI. And I think
Mm.
I hope that like, orchestras, institutions, performers, audiences, I think and I hope that they recognize that what we have is even more precious and more irreplaceable because of AI, not the other way around.
Mm. And I feel like a lot of music students, especially in this day and age, they like kind of don't know where to start. And so, do you have any like tips on how they can like, understand modern classical music better, or just how to start in general?
I have to be honest, I think it's slightly different now than when I was growing up because,
Mm.
for example, now on YouTube, I see so many videos of sheet music, so many videos of contemporary music and of course, more standard repertoire and classical music out there that it might feel like there's too much, right? There's almost
Hmm.
overwhelming amounts of resources and just videos and clips and media of what we do. So I think the challenge is how to provide like perhaps a little more guidance and more curation for a young student to start kind of not so much in the deep end, but maybe somehow uh, in a more kind of structured, shallow to deep way, of
Mm.
getting to know all this music. And that's something I think I've been thinking about it, but I'm not quite sure what that would look like. But I think more than ever is the need for us as musicians, you and me, to not only do our music and do our art, but also to figure out more ways to communicate, to reach out. Because it's this kind of context that we bring when we talk and we present that I think is as helpful, if not more helpful, for students that might feel a little bit lost about where to start, right? So it's so something like what classical, is that how you pronounce that? Like,
Classical? Yeah.
yeah, so that's a really meaningful way of doing that, right? So I think if there are ways we can really think outside the box and not just think about the music, but also how we can help frame it and present it. I think that's going to be valuable both to us and of course to people that are younger.
Hmm. And would you say that contemporary music is like inaccessible to most people who are like not already like musicians?
I think historically, there's a
Hmm.
period, especially from the 20th century, where there was more of a mentality that contemporary music needed to be complex, it needed to be more abstract, and it needed to be hard to understand in a way.
Mm.
I think thankfully we've really moved away from that mentality by 2026. Um, so I think we are now in a perhaps golden age where contemporary music is accessible, and I think a lot of the music being written is trying hard to expand, right? Like to bring
Hmm.
in more audiences and to tie in discussions with extra musical topics that are very pertinent today, right? Um, so I think in some ways it's probably better now than it probably was a few decades ago. And I've been very fortunate where most of the schooling I've gone through, I've never felt like the pressure from teachers to write a certain style or to write a certain way. Even though I've heard stories of people that, studied years ago that did have that pressure that, they were always judged and that contemporary music used to really have kind of very defined aesthetic camps that felt like they were the right answer for contemporary music and were not so accepting of other languages or other aesthetic viewpoints. In fact, in some ways, now we have the opposite challenge where it feels like anything goes.
Mm.
So that is almost a different sort of challenge, where if you can truly write in any kind of style you're interested in or any aesthetic you're in, what does it really mean to be a composer? Like that becomes or what does it mean to write a piece of music? Like what does quote unquote good or bad mean, right? Like that is a very actually difficult and perhaps impossibly difficult question to answer. So I think all that is just to say we um, we our time now or our relationship with the label contemporary classical music is probably very different than what it would have been a few
Mm.
decades ago.
And I also think it's kind of interesting how like usually we can classify like specific type of music, such as like Baroque music or like classical or like romantic. And I feel like it's kind of challenging to do that with like contemporary music just because there's like such a big range of music out there. And
Mhm.
do you have any like composers in mind who you think like deserve to be like remembered or like more recognized?
Yeah, like quite a few on my mind. First of all, there's so many active composers today whose music I love.
Hmm.
So for example, someone that's very active and who I really look up to is Gabriella Smith. Her music is and I think part of that is because I myself love hiking and love being in nature, and her music a lot of it's inspired by these kind of natural landscapes and
Hmm.
soundscapes, and the way she can bring that that sort of world building into the concert hall and to immerse listeners is something that really inspires me and something I really deeply admire.
Hmm.
Um, there's a French Chinese composer named Chigan Chen who is quite well known in China and in Europe and has also more recently been more programmed in the West. He is the last student of the French composer Olivier Messiaen, and his music is so refined and exquisite and this like really beautiful blend of kind of French post-impressionism with Chinese elements and Chinese traditional music. So I do feel like his music deserves to be played more, especially in the US. Um, and again, I think he's been performed more recently, so that's something I've been really, happy to hear about. And I have to also mention two of my mentors who I'm, very grateful for their teaching, but I'm also a huge fans of. So one is the Chinese American composer Tan Duan.
Mm,
who is most well known for his Academy Award-winning score to the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. But he's primarily also a composer of concert music, so just absolutely inspired by his just his limitless imagination and his very, very wide-ranging body of work. And also Gabriella Lena Frank, who I was very fortunate to be mentored by more recently. She uh, in fact, I think she has an opera that's currently at the Met right now, in fact, about the sort of like the biography or the life story of Frida Kahlo, of Mexican painter Frida Kahlo.
mhm,
Um, but in addition to a lot of the wonderful music she writes, she also has this creative academy of music she's built, where she mentors a lot of young composers and gives us a lot of really amazing advice that's really beyond what we can learn like in school. And a lot of it's like life advice. A lot of it's about, not just writing music, but how do you sustain yourself as a creative individual so that you have the fire in you to not just write this current piece of music, but really to be able to keep writing, to have this kind of longevity of a creative life. And so I'm just deeply grateful for her and for all the, wonderful teachers I've had to, allow me to develop into who I am today. So I think,
mm,
and inevitably I'm also thinking about, out of that gratitude, I'm also hoping to explore more ways I can then pay that forward, right, with younger composers as well.
mhm. And do you have any like educational institutes or like outreach programs that you think are that you find particularly like promising in like expanding classical music, I mean contemporary classical music?
Sorry, I need to think a little bit. Because I'm trying to think back on like, also like festivals I've done.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think now younger composers have a plethora of different sort of opportunities they can pursue. There's so many different kinds of like training programs, particularly like summer, like
Yeah.
festivals or camps that happen during the summer. Um, like ones that come up top of my head that I've been to, for example, of course, Interlochen we mentioned earlier, right? They have for pre-college students, they have so specifically grade 9 to 12, they have a wonderful 6 week composition program. Which again is where I first had my first like composition lesson, first time I ever took theory class, that kind of thing. Um, the Bowden Festival in Maine
Hmm.
is a really good one as well for especially if students are interested in kind of learning more about chamber music because it has a very strong composition sort of component led by Derek Bermel, wonderful composer and clarinetist. But it also, more generally, has this kind of focus on chamber music from all time periods. So I think that's invaluable learning for students, right? Like the big name festivals like Aspen and Tanglewood, of course,
Hmm.
are also very prestigious summer opportunities. So I think now, honestly, there's just so many opportunities out there that it's like this. Maybe the challenge is like trying to find one that's like appropriate for you, or like like that meets your needs at where you are in at this time or this stage of your composition journey. That might be challenging, just because there's so many opportunities, so many festivals, and I would assume probably even more than when I was being a student.
Hmm. And are there any like emerging trends or like movement that you believe will impact like the industry positively or negatively?
Hmm. I'm trying to think. I think one positive trend I've noticed, I suppose, I guess two, but they really combine, is that especially from large performing institutions like orchestras and so forth,
Hmm.
there seems to be increasing interest in commissioning younger composers and also local composers in the sense that like if the orchestra is in this city that they're interested or this state that they're interested in focusing more on telling the stories of artists that work in this state. And I just really hope that trend continues, because especially with things like commissions, it's always easy to go with a known name, right? To go with an established name. But I think a lot of young composers, it's that one opportunity, one time that someone, some institution takes risk and believes in them and gives them the opportunity that might be the make or break of a career. So I would really hope just that in general institutions are just a little bit more risk taking and have more ways to give opportunities to young composers and just or composers that just haven't had that first big leap just yet. The other thing is, and again, this is not something I'm particularly knowledgeable about, but my observation is there's a lot of opera companies, especially in the US, that are very new music friendly and
Hmm.
are actively composing and actively hungry for new American opera. So I think that's a really wonderful development. And I think just as we talk about how do we connect with audiences, I think there's no better way than to be able to commission new work and through that
Hmm.
actually build more audiences. And I think more on my personal end, something I've been thinking a lot about is because again I'm a huge fan of the outdoors and hiking and being out in nature. Recently I was the artist in residence at Zion National Park in Utah, and that has been a completely life-changing and transformative experience for me. And something I noticed is that part of my residency I had to give a presentation on my music
Hmm.
to like visitors in the park and people in the community around the park in Springdale, Utah. And because the park put posters up of my presentation, right, I got a really interesting blend of people that came to hear me talk about my composition. This are people that just happened to be visiting the park that day, to park rangers and like staff members that work in the education department, to local artists and local people, local patrons of the arts that have been living in Springdale for many years. And so what I've realized is that when we can bring our extra musical interest in to our musical lives and find that overlap, that's one way we can also build more audiences. And there were people that came up to me afterwards that said, "Wow, they've never heard." First of all, they've never heard a living composer talk, but also they've never heard a living composer really present about their process before, and that really made them want to find out more, right? So I think
Hmm.
that's one thing we, as individuals and as like performing arts organizations, can look into is how do we find that overlap? How do we find overlaps with other interests of ours, and how that can actually help us build a broader audience as well.
Hmm. And that was actually it for all the questions I prepared. So I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really enjoyed like getting to know about your personal process, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sejin. It's nice
Mhm.
to talk. Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.